Hello. I'd like to welcome you to our current research at the University of California, Berkeley webinar series. I see many people have joined the webinar and are letting us know who they are and giving us their affiliation in the chat box. Please go ahead and do that. I have stopped the music. You'll notice that the actual voices are not as loud as the music. If you cannot hear well enough, what you need to do is look at the top of your screen. You'll see a speaker button and make sure that that's at top volume. Also from your computer, the computer speakers should be at top volume. And if it still does not sound good, then we suggest headphones if that helps you. Also, we are recording the webinar today, and sometimes people have trouble with their technical issues, can listen to the recorded webinar without any problems. So we could also suggest that as a technical solution. Please go ahead and click your affiliation, professional focus, and experience with LiDAR on our polls, which helps us with figuring out, who's on the call and how much experience they already have. As you have questions moving forward for the speaker, please go ahead and type them in the chat box and they'll be addressed at the end of the talk. And then I also just wanted to let you know that at the end of the webinar, we'll have some references available for you from the talk. We'll have web links to an evaluation survey we hope you take and to more information and the rest of the webinar series. So with that said, I'd like to turn it over to Rick Standiford to introduce our speaker. Go ahead, Rick.
Thanks a lot, Susie. Welcome everyone again to this third in our series. Our speaker today is a faculty member and cooperative extension specialist here at UC Berkeley, Dr. Maggie Kelly. Maggie is both a professor here as well as a CE specialist, and she also serves as the director of our Geospatial Innovation Facility, which is a campus environmental monitoring, remote sensing, GIS laboratory here. And Maggie will be talking to us today about LiDAR, which is an emerging form of technology for remote sensing, and one I think we'll all benefit from hearing a little more about. So Maggie, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks a lot, Rick and Susie, and welcome everybody. This is my first time doing a webinar through these guys. They're doing a great job setting everything up, but I don't see the webinar itself. But I think, Susie, you're setting that up.
Yeah, I just wanted to give everyone a last minute to go ahead and tell us what their affiliation is. Looks like our largest percentage is state and local government and university.
Yeah.
Mostly forestry focus, but also some biology, ecology, and other. And then our biggest level of experience is none, which includes me, beginner, and then we have a few intermediates and advanced. So thank you everyone for letting us know. I'll go ahead and bring up the presentation now.
That's great, and there's a nice blend of people in terms of background and interest, and so I've tried to put together something that focused on forest science and forest management, but I'm not going to be able to answer everything in the time that we've got, so I do encourage you to ask questions at the end, and I'll answer them and see if there's enough questions that I haven't been able to cover in the talk. We can think about doing something as a follow-up. So today I'm going to talk to you about LiDAR. Finding the trees in the forest is the title, using LiDAR, light detection and ranging, for forest science and management. And I do want to separate and focus on both of those a little bit separately. A lot of the work that we've done at Berkeley, and I'll show you some of these, comes from our Sierra Nevada Adaptive Management Project. And to that end, many of the slides I'll show you today owe credit to the rest of the Sierra Nevada Adaptive Management Project spatial team that's headed up by myself and Chinua Guo at UC Merced and our students and staff, particularly Sam Blanchard, Jacob Flanagan, Marek Jakubowski, Wen Kai Li and Feng Zhao, and so I wanted to give them credit at the beginning of the talk. So we'll go ahead. So what I'm going to split this brief overview up into LiDAR basics. We'll talk about LiDAR and forest science, LiDAR and forest management, and I'll illustrate both of those with the current literature. I'll talk about our SNAP LiDAR work, and then where you can get more information about LiDAR, and in particular data and software. So we have a great decades-long tradition of monitoring and mapping forests worldwide through our remote sensing program. We've been able to leverage a suite of satellites to understand forest changes, and this technology and longevity is really something to be commended. The latest in this series is the Landsat 8 satellite that was successfully launched February 11th, and the first images were actually made available by NASA this week. So we've done a lot with this optical view of remote sensing, this view from overhead across a suite of satellites such as MODIS at pretty coarse scales and Landsat at 30-meter, and then things like NAPE and other digital photography projects at 1 meter and smaller, have done really tremendous work monitoring and mapping forest and forest changes. And they've allowed us to come up with measures for things like canopy cover, vegetation productivity, phenology, vigor and health, and vegetation patterning with really broad scale and very timely coverage. So we owe a lot to this optical remote sensing tradition in forestry, but we don't get much about the vertical structure in forests. And this slide depicts actual LiDAR data from our Sierra Nevada project. Each one of the white dots is a LiDAR return. So that's the X and Y and Z location of the amount of light that's returned to a sensor. The orange colors at the bottom indicate ground, and the white indicates tree canopy. And you can easily see the individual trees here. And so LiDAR is being promoted as a way to not just get at the view from above, but get at the view from below and through the canopy, and really understand vertical structure. And the way it works is, I'll show you here in a quick animation. We can now capture LiDAR in a range of different ways, most commonly from the air via helicopter or aircraft. But we also have terrestrial or ground-based LiDAR. That's the picture on the upper right. And there's increasing work looking at LiDAR cameras that have both a camera and a LiDAR system combined. The way the technology works is, if you look here at there's a cartoon of a LiDAR instrument. It basically has an emitter and a detector, and the emitter will send out a light signal. It'll be reflected back from some target, and in this case the target is just the ground. And the time it takes for that signal to reach the target and come back with the speed of light will give us the total distance traveled, because light travels at the speed of light. So we say time between emitted and detected will give us the total distance. Divided by 2 is the distance to the ground from the emitter. And the neat thing is that because the energy of the light isn't reflected all at once, we can have what's called discrete return LiDAR. So this next slide will show you an example. The light is emitted from the emitter and it hits the first target. That's the branch or leaf of a tree. Some portion of that energy continues and then hits the next target. In this case, it's the ground. And so if you look at the bottom graph, the amplitude of detected signal, you have 2 peaks One is for the first thing it hit, and the second is for the last thing it hit. And those can be resolved into these two returns, the first return and the last return. And so what we're describing here is very commonly used. It's called discrete return LiDAR data. And in this case, we have two returns. And typically, most vendors who provide access to these data will have up to 4 returns. But in this case, this simple cartoon, we're just looking at 2. The next thing about the LiDAR instrument that's pretty neat is the LiDAR. It's usually, like I said, on some kind of aircraft. And the onboard will be a GPS, global positioning system, and an IMU, an inertial measurement unit that'll tell the aircraft exactly where it is, X, Y, and elevation. And by simple geometry and looking at the position of the aircraft, you can figure out the distance to those targets and get on the ground X, Y, and Z locations of each of those hits. So the data itself is really just, when you're working with discrete return LiDAR data, it's really just a collection of points of X and Y location, Z, which is elevation off of the ground, and then some other information associated with that, such as intensity. But we don't use that intensity as much as just that X, Y, and Z. And so here's another example of what the data looks like. On the top panel, you have a typical swath of LiDAR data and all the returns, first, second, third, and fourth. The first return, that green panel, is, as I said, it's the first thing that the energy hits, and in forests, it's typically the top of the canopy. The bottom panel is the last return, and that's the last thing that energy hits, and that's typically the forest floor, although there are some exceptions to that. And then the second and third returns are pickup, canopy, and understory between the top of the trees and the forest floor. This, to what we've been talking about so far, has to do with discrete LiDAR data. And I'll show you some of our results in using those kinds of data. You'll see, though, currently there's a lot of work being done using waveform, which is really the next step in LiDAR, especially in forests. The panel on the right is a graph comparing discrete return and full waveform. I apologize, the graphic got cut off a little bit on the right. But you'll see here the left part of that graphic has 2 returns there at the bottom, whereas the panel on the right shows the full waveform. So instead of just getting a return that indicates something was hit, you get the full amplitude and width of that return. It's a lot more, it's a lot bigger data set, but it will give us a lot more to work with when we're mapping forests. So that was, in a nutshell, the way the technology works. In 2002, Mike Lefsky, who's one of the leaders in this field, and others wrote this paper, really nice paper in bioscience, LiDAR remote sensing for ecosystem studies. And in 2002, they say, developments in LiDAR remote sensing are occurring so rapidly that it's difficult to predict which applications will be dominant in 5 years. And they list a few of them that they think are important: ground topography, 3D structure and function of vegetation canopies, forest stand structure attributes, and animal habitat mapping. And those really haven't changed in the 10 years since this paper was published, although we can add to that list an increased focus on using LiDAR for carbon and biomass studies, and also an increase in focus in scale. So there's more studies looking at large-scale forest estimation, regionally and even globally. If you do a quick look at the literature review, 10 years ago, 12 years ago, there was really just a handful of papers in this field, and It's exploded and continues to increase across these domains. Topography, forest science, biomass management, wildlife, and timber continue to go up. Biomass and carbon is really on the upswing with LiDAR, or the number of publications that focus on this are really increasing. So I thought I'd go through a few of these briefly. The first is the topography aspect. So LiDAR is increasingly used for large-scale, yet extremely detailed mapping of surface topography because, again, it can penetrate through vegetation and give you a really detailed depiction of the ground. This is just one example. We're talking about large-scale. The entire state of North Carolina is being mapped with LiDAR for topography, primarily for flood insurance. And it's really incredibly detailed stuff and much better resolution than is provided by the USGS. That's demonstrated in this next slide. This is a paper recently published. The left panel, panel A, is the digital elevation model from the USGS. The right two panels, B and C, are the LiDAR-derived surface topography. This particular study was interested in landslide mapping, and they recognized the distinct advantage of LiDAR technology for mapping small-scale topographic features underneath the forest. The difference between B and C is just they've put a few image enhancements to really show these landslide features. But you can map surface topography down to the scale of a meter if you want to, showing things like trails and boulders and phenomenal details. But when we talk about forests, we're probably more or as interested in looking at tree height and forest height. The graphic here just depicts a typical LiDAR depiction of a forest stand. The dots here again are individual returns to the sensor, and they're color-coded by tree height. And these data are commonly used to measure and estimate forest height at the individual tree scale and at the plot scale, and also across landscapes. We're doing this in our SNAP project, and I'll show you some work coming up. But I wanted to highlight some interesting work, again, by Mike Lefsky. This is more recently showing this ability to look at regional scale mapping of forest height. So this is a global map. Other activities that are relevant to forest science are mapping canopy structure, and particularly how canopy structure plays a role in habitat suitability. This is a great paper from Veering et al., Shedding New Light on Habitat Characterization and Modeling. They show here a canopy cover as you move up through the forest. So canopy cover in terms of percent, but not just from above as we'd expect or we'd get from optical remote sensing, but canopy cover from at 2 to 5 meters above the ground, at 5 to 12 meters above the ground, at 12 to 24 meters above the ground, etc. And so you can see where the green life in the forest is distributed. It's not distributed evenly, and you can get really very detailed maps of the way in which vegetation biomass is distributed through that vertical column. Again, I mentioned this. This is an area where LiDAR is increasing. This is in mapping biomass and carbon estimates. One of the leaders in this field is Greg Asner, and this is just an example from just one of his papers looking at mapping biomass over large scales at the really sort of state scale or country scale. And he uses detailed field measurements and airborne LiDAR and sometimes optical remote sensing and hyperspectral imagery to get at biomass, and has done some fascinating work here. The carbon and biomass stuff that I'm going to show you really does depend on detailed field measures. We haven't gotten to the level where you can just use LiDAR alone to get at biomass. LiDAR is also being used often in concert with hyperspectral imagery or other imagery sources to not just get at biomass, but also to get at tree stress and vigor. So this is a neat paper as well, looking at the Sierra Nevada and mapping these individual trees in relation to their biomass, but also their condition. I'm not going to dwell much on terrestrial ground-based LiDAR. It is increasingly used in forest science. The difference is that the LiDAR sensor is ground-based. It's mounted on a tripod, such as you see on the upper left-hand corner, and it maps 360 degrees in a circle, but also from horizon to horizon. The graphic on the bottom is such, and it's actually not an image, it's a depiction of all the millions of LiDAR hits in a particular forest stand. So you can map things like canopy height, basal area, stem density, vertical foliage distribution, and there are people who are using these data to get at leaf area index. And typically you can map about 200 meters away, depends of course on the density of your forest, about 200 meters away from where you've set up this terrestrial LiDAR tripod. So that was a brief foray into forest science. There are other aspects to talk about, but I want to talk quickly also about LiDAR and forest management. And there are fewer papers that focus on management, but there are some. Mike Wilder, another leader in this particular area, has written this nice paper, The Role of LiDAR in Sustainable Forest Management. In 2008, he has a somewhat cautious view about the use of LiDAR and management. I'll show you some